Ladies and gentlemen, GTX 1070. 6.5 teraflops, 8 gigabytes of G5 memory, faster than a Titan X, $379 MSRP. And for the NVIDIA designed Founders Edition, $449, available all over the world, June 10th.
When the GTX 1070 was released in 2016, it brought a remarkable combination of computer power and value that is very hard to beat even by today's standards. Based upon the evolutionary Pascal architecture, the GTX 1070 it was basically a cut-down version of the NVIDIA's flagship GTX 1080. With exception of the fewer shader and streaming multiprocessors, the texture mapping units and the support of the regular 8GB GDDR5, instead the slightly faster GDDR5X RAM, both GPUs empowered by the same GP104 chipset. Due to this fact, Nvidia was able to drop the price of the GTX 1070 at such a level that not only destroyed all AMD's hopes of coming up with an answer, but it also destroyed Nvidia's own previous generation products that belonged to the same or even higher tier chipset. This was all Nvidia's graphics cards based on the former Maxwell architecture, like the same tier GTX 970 priced at $350, the higher tier GTX 980 priced at $550, and the GTX Titan X. Undoubtedly, until the launch day of Pascal chipset, the king of all graphics cards, sold back then for over $1,000. The GTX 1070 scooped all the above GPUs, offering superior performance at MSRP of only $450. The GTX 1070 primarily intended to target the 1440 resolution gamers who wanted to own a high-end graphics card without breaking the bank by spending more than $650 buying the higher performing brother GTX 1080. Of course, what once was the high settings gaming chipset at some point will unavoidably be the low settings hardware. For that reason, I made this retrospective video to remember how good GTX 1070 was back in the days, how much can it stick it out with modern gaming titles, and how much future-proof can it be in the years to come. My test subject, the main protagonist of this content, will be the Palit GTX 1070 Dual, a graphics card that I had to buy under the Frankenstein GPU market some months ago at an unreasonable price, since all of my previous graphics cards suddenly died. More about that horror story you can watch by clicking on the appearing card at the top right corner of your screen or by following the given link at the description below. To get back to our story, the Palit GTX 1070 must endure everything I will throw at it during my underdeveloped benchmarking procedure. For this reason, a fellowship of computer parts will gather up together to aid our hero. Beginning with the motherboard. An MSI B450M MORTAR accompanied by AMD's Ryzen 7 1700 processor overclocked at 3.7 GHz to mitigate as much as possible any CPU bottleneck. The 32GB of 3200 MHz DDR4 memory will be plenty for the task, and the 650W power supply unit can provide more than enough power for our components. For storage, I use a 1TB Western Digital Blue NVMe M.2 drive that hosts a fresh installed copy of Windows 10 version 21H2 and all the necessary software to complete the tests. A 27-inch 1080 max resolution and 60Hz refresh rate will be the main display monitor, which provides a typical resolution that almost 70% of gamers are using according to Steam's hardware survey of March 2022. Due to the GTX 1070 promoted by Nvidia as a 1440 graphics card, I needed to run the test as well at that resolution on my limited 1080p monitor, so I had to come up somehow with a workaround solution. For those they don't know, since the Maxwell GPU era there is Nvidia's DSR aka Dynamic Super Resolution technology. What DSR does is to render a motion picture at a higher, more detailed resolution, and then it syncs the resulting picture back to the monitor's native resolution. Using this method, I can upscale any game at resolutions above 1080 so I can test the Palit GTX 1070 at 1440p without the need to acquire a 2K monitor. To ensure that no other procedure will interfere with the testing results, I use a second computer to record and an Elgato external USB device to capture the gameplay footage. The final video output is the result of 1080 30fps MP4 file. The graphics card is running with the latest Nvidia drivers, and the Nvidia 3D settings are adjusted for high performance with the VSync disabled, letting the GPU uncap to achieve the highest possible frames per second. To measure the performance of the graphics card, I'm going to use two software tools, the MSI Afterburner combined with Riva Tuner Server. Most of the benchmarking footage will include a layout with numbers at the top left corner of the screen. For your comfort, every time I'm going to refer on a specific element of MSI layout, I will also highlight it so it will be easier for you to comprehend the benchmarking narration. General rule of thumb, the higher the frames per second and the lower the frame time, the better the gameplay experience. Now that we're done with testing methodology, it is time to proceed with the nuts and bolts of this video, the benchmarking tests. I will initialize my examination using the well-known synthetic benchmark 3D Mark TimeSpy. The demo version is locked at DirectX 12 1440 resolution. The final results are unrelated with Palit's true gaming performance, but they can be used as comparison rule between different GPU chipsets. In our case, the Palit GTX 1070 Dual gave an overall score of 6129 and graphics score of 5867 points. A performance score almost on par with newer graphics cards like AMD's Vega 56 and Nvidia's GTX 1660 Super or Ti variations. Considering that GTX 1070 launched in 2016, it will be appropriate to examine how it performed in few popular video games from that era, so that we can observe better the performance decline as time passed. Thus, I booted up the rebooted version of Doom, a well-known first-person shooter based on the Tech 6 engine created by ID that introduced back then in the gaming scene some fresh visual effects and dynamic lightings. The game demo crashed whenever I tried to use Vulkan API, so I proceeded with OpenGL 4.5 at 1080 Ultra settings, running multiply times the early levels of the first campaign. The combined results gave 131 average frames per second with 1% low at 65 and low frame times with flat frame graph. Encouraged by the good performance at 1080, I was curious to see how good is GTX 1070 at 1440 resolution, implementing the DSR upscale. And the graphics card gave again great results with 95 average and 1% low at 67 FPS with a minor increase at frame time measurements. I wasn't sure why both 1080 and 1440 got almost the same 1% low results. Even though the GPU worked at maximum levels, the temperature was well checked, and the CPU barely was reaching 35% workload, eliminating any suspicion for CPU bottleneck. Another successful title back from 2016 is Battlefield 1 that even after 6 years, the multiplayer servers are crowded with people slaughtering each other at picturesque fields on this well-made first-person shooter. I began the tests on campaign mode, selecting DirectX 11 instead of DirectX 12 since the former is more optimized for the Frostbite 3 engine which is used at this game. 1080 Ultra settings, the Palit GTX 1070 reached 110 average and 91 for 1% low FPS, nothing challenging to see here. So I switched to 1440 DSR resolution and received again some very decent numbers with average 84 and 1% low 74 frames per second. I thought campaign mode maybe was a bit forgiving, thus it will be a good idea to play a couple of multiplayer runs to check out if the GTX 1070 was indeed capable of 1440 GPU even under some more demanding situations. And indeed it was. Although the mayhem of the battle, simulating high-paced gameplay scenarios, the graphics card offered a smooth frame time graph with 75 and 65 FPS on average and 1% low respectively. Now that I had a performance sample running AAA titles of 2016, I could move on into some more modern games following a chronological order. Using my own fictional DeLorean time machine, I could travel a bit more to the future, more specific to 2018, so I could run the integrated benchmark of Forza Horizon 4. Back then, this game was one of the most visually impressive racing games, providing some magnificent landscapes, seasonal weather conditions, and day-to-night cycle. Choosing the only available API, DirectX 12 and Ultra settings at 1080, the GTX 1070 reached average 97 and 1% low of 73 FPS. Easy stuff for the Palit GTX 1070 Dual, so the next step was to try the 1440 resolution and getting average 75 frames per second with moderate frame times and flat frame graph. Even though the 1% low missed by one the minimum 60 FPS, the performance was almost flawless. I didn't feel that I was quite done with 2018, so for the next game I chose something more strong, feminine, and all over more Tomb Bannon. Shadow of Tomb Raider, still today considers a very demanding game. Moreover, it comes with an integrated benchmark using various camera perspectives and environment types, separated into 3 different parts, with the first and the last part being the most stressful. Using DirectX 12 Ultra settings at 1080, the GTX 1070 produced average 75 and 1% low 61 frames per second, working constantly at 100% and consuming 6.5GB VRAM, indicating that any attempt to run this game at 1440 resolution will fail to keep the 1% low above the mandatory 60 frames per second. Rumors have it that the built-in benchmark produces results very similar to real gameplay, so I had to challenge the statement by keeping the settings as it was, enabling the VSync function and playing the game for about 30 minutes. More or less, the outcome was in par with the integrated benchmark. The overall and average frame rate index was stuck at 60 FPS, offering a solid gameplay experience. My only concern was purely academic, because the 1% low was fluctuating a few points below the 60 frames cap. Not an actual problem, since the gameplay experience was pretty solid. Despite that, to determine if this caused by some weird software glitch or hardware inability, I dropped the settings to the lowest possible. And surprisingly, nothing changed. Since this period of time I'm reading off my obsessive benchmarking disorder, I decided to move on with my life, operating the imaginary time machine to travel in 2019. This time, the integrated benchmark belonged to the Division 2, that contains high detailed graphics, slick effects and gorgeous reflections capable to make any hardware from the past to work hard for the money. With DirectX 12 at 1080 Ultra settings, the Palit GTX 1070 Dual scored on average 66 frames and the 1% low fell 7 short the minimum 60. Still, very capable experience with no sudden stutters. Same settings but 1440 resolution, we had as expected worse numbers, with the average and 1% low dropping even more at 42 and 35 frames per second respectively. At this point the graphics motion was becoming slightly laggy, so I went back to 1080, but this time I played for some minutes the campaign mode. With 74 average and 54 1% low frames per second, I got more or less numbers similar to integrated benchmark. Just like Shadow of Tomb Raider, the Division 2, even though was running smoothly at 1080, the GTX 1070 couldn't reach for some hairs the 60 FPS at 1% low, pointing that a further drop to high or even medium settings will be necessary to stay above that magic number. As for the 1440 resolution users, I'm afraid that the only realistic choice here is to switch to lowest settings. Could that conclusion discourage our time travel? Absolutely not. Thus, here we are at 2020, the year when everybody hiding behind walls, masks and mandatory measures, the battlefields of Total War Saga Troy was crowded with armies ready to bring any high-tier hardware of the past to their knees. At 1080 Ultra settings and DirectX 12, the battle benchmark reached 74 and 63 frames per second on average and 1% low, quite an achievement for our 6 years old GPU. At 1440 there was an obvious performance drop below the 60 mark on both average and 1% low. Despite the moderately high frame time, the frame graph lacked sudden peaks and valleys. The CPU workload was under 50% while the GPU stayed constantly at 99%, clearly showcasing the bottlenecking suspect here. And with that we reached the year 2021. Hairy and dark, like the bold and shiny head of Hitman 3, with the resource-demanding dark moors in benchmark. That it was a bit of strength for the GTX 1070, especially for the 1% low hitting only 36 frames per second at 1080 Ultra settings, with the average FPS staying above the 70 mark. Surprisingly, changing to high settings, the 1% low didn't go any better, despite the 10 frames increase to average index. Both settings caused high workloads on GPU and CPU, and at moments the frame time was very jumpy. Surely, switching to 1440 high settings wouldn't stress the GPU any less. The average FPS got worse, but paradoxically, the 1% low remained at the same levels we saw at 1080 resolution. That was a bit weird, but life is small, so let's keep moving forward and more specific traveling to present year. Picking from the basket of 2022 the latest version of Fortnite Chapter 3 Season 2. Admittedly, not the most resource-intensive genre you can choose from, but it is an excellent example to observe GTX 1070's behavior running a popular free-to-play sports game. Fortnite's Rumble mode is my preferred choice when I choose Fortnite as benchmarking tool, since you can respawn on elimination, thus you keep the map filled with high number of characters fighting each other non-stop for a good 10 to 15 minutes. Using 1080 performance mode at high settings, the graphics card did it excellent, reaching 175 average and 101 frames per second on 1% low. So all the sport players, owners of GTX 1070, can rest assured that their graphics card has plenty of years ahead of it before it becomes absolute obsolete for this type of PC games. As for the present time, it deserves a bigger contender, and Halo Infinite, though not technically a 2022 game, is perfect for the continuation of my story. This is due to the fact that I can perform my benchmarking tests by playing the demo version of the game on multiplayer maps, after which I can repeat the same path of the arena multiple times until I have enough sample results to draw conclusions. As usual, DirectX 12 1080 Ultra gave 76 average, with 1% low missing the 60 mark by 3 frames. Running at 1440 Ultra settings, the outcome made it clear that GTX 1070 couldn't handle very well this resolution. The 54 and 44 average and 1% low frame rate respectively stands very far from the desired minimum. At high settings 1080 resolution, we had a 7% increase on average FPS, with 1% low hitting bullseye, the 60 frames per second. So the next question was, what will happen to that perfect 60 if I deploy some bots in the arena? And this is what exactly I did. Regardless the change, the 1% low kept its perfect score and the average FPS increased by 10%. Overall, the Palit GTX 1070 Dual has aged very well over the last 6 years. It is very capable to run most PC games at high settings and 1080 with some exceptions. And it can still run most of the AAA games at 1440, but only with the necessary sacrifice of visual fidelity. Definitely I can't foresee the future, but I recognize that the majority of the most recent and upcoming well-known gaming titles constrain their hardware requirements to keep it in line with Sony's PlayStation 5 and Microsoft's Xbox Series hardware. Obviously, we can't directly compare the dedicated hardware of a gaming console with a PC graphics card. Moreover, we have to take it into account on which platform the game was originally made. But for the sake of our story, let's say that a capable 4K PlayStation 5 imitates on average the capabilities of Nvidia's GTX 3060 Ti, or if you like, is a bit worse than AMD's RX 5700 XT. For sure, both GPUs are far superior to the humble GTX 1070. So we have to take a step back, looking at the weaker in specs 1080 resolution able Xbox Series S that has a graphics processor which resembles Nvidia's GTX 1060 but with ray tracing capacity. This is the lowest level standard for all Xbox supporting gaming titles and their PC ports. And I strongly believe that the majority of game developers will have this minimum hardware specification in mind whenever they plan to create a new gaming title regardless the platform. Taking the above technical assumptions into account, the GTX 1070 stands right now at the top level of the low-tier GPU hierarchy. Since the cycle of next-gen gaming consoles occurs every 5 years, I can hesitantly predict that Xbox Series S hardware will remain the standard minimum requirement until 2026 or so. Thus, I expect the GTX 1070 to also remain relevant by running most of the games at 1080 middle settings. On the other hand, PC-exclusive games are increasingly becoming more hardware demanding. Taking a look at Epic Games' upgrade to Unreal Engine 5 through the recent demo of Matrix Awaken makes the above statement more apparent than ever. With the 8GB VRAM gradually becoming the new minimum and the obvious incapability of GTX 1070 to reach 60 frames per second while running the most recent games at 1440p on high settings, it showcases that the battle of high resolutions is already lost. Someone once said that the future is something fluent. There are forces in the horizon that are capable to interfere and prolong furthermore the life of every GPU. Software implementations like FSR or even NIS are the harbingers of the new era of image upscaling and sharpening algorithms that are constantly improving their capabilities with the more recent additions of DLSS version 2 and Radeon Super Resolution. Testing the 2-year-old NIS technology in Shadow of Tomb Raider by comparing side by side the neutral 1080 resolution with the 720 NIS 30% sharpening footage, I've seen a whopping 35% higher performance with some moderate decrease in graphics quality. With all that in mind, we can be more than optimistic about what the future holds, not only for the owners of the GTX 1070 but also for everyone who holds an old graphics unit. Some people might also try the overclocking path as a mean to get a 5 to 10% extra performance, which I'm always reluctant to do this type of tweaking when it is about old graphics cards that have no warranty anymore and no clear history of use if purchased second hand. Instead, it will be safer and it will offer higher FPS gains by following Nvidia's image scaling path or even AMD's FSR technology if it is supported by your gaming title. On the other hand, in case you are the proud owner of a GTX 1050 Ti, I suggest to check out my video with the title How Good is GTX 1050 Ti for Gaming 2022 that you can find the corresponding link in the description below, or you can access now by clicking on the corresponding end screen link. Until we meet again, take care, farewell, goodbye, see you in a while.